Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It feels like every time we turn around, the Middle East is making headlines again.
Oh, it definitely keeps us on our toes.
So you've given me this stack of articles to go through.
DW, VOA News, Politico Business Recorder, even some Ariana News and Al Jazeera.
You want to do a deep dive into all the latest developments?
Specifically the conflicts involving Israel-Hezbollah and Hamas.
So much to unpack.
Yeah, it's a real mess. But the first thing that jumps out at me is just how interconnected everything is. You know, one event triggers a reaction somewhere else, and then that reaction leads to another one, and...
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. Like, for example, the recent rocket barrage from Hezbollah into Israel.
Oh, right, from Lebanon.
Yeah, it was massive. Over 250 rockets and projectiles. Some even reached Tel Aviv.
I read about that. There was damage and injuries.
At least 7 people injured, according to DW and VOA News.
Wow. And this was retaliation.
It seems that way. A response to an Israeli airstrike on Beirut.
The one that killed at least 29 people.
Yeah, tragically. It's that tit-for-tat violence that just keeps this conflict going.
It's heartbreaking. And VOA News and Politico both highlighted that the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah has actually been going on for over a year now.
That's right. Starting with Hezbollah's support for Hamas, and now it's escalated to one of the most intense periods of fighting since the 2006 war.
Right. It's scary to think how quickly things can spiral out of control.
And the human cost is immense. Politico reported that over 3,700 people have died in Lebanon from the Israeli attacks, and 1.2 million people have been displaced.
Those are just staggering numbers. I can't even imagine being forced from my home.
It's a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. And then there's this incident.
You mean the Israeli strike on a Lebanese army center?
Yes. Tragically, a soldier was killed and 18 others were wounded.
DW and VOA both had that story.
It just shows how quickly things can go wrong, even when Israel claims it's only targeting Hezbollah militants.
Right. It's hard to be precise in these situations.
And of course, Lebanon's caretaker prime minister is furious. He criticized Israel for undermining ceasefire efforts, according to Politico.
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
It certainly doesn't. It seems like every time there's a glimmer of hope, something happens to derail the peace process.
So are there actually any real talks of a ceasefire going on?
There are. The U.S. is trying to broker a deal between Israel and Hezbollah.
So maybe there's still a chance?
I hope so. But the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, expressed some doubts. You can find his quotes in both VOA and Politico. He is concerned about Israel's commitment to a ceasefire, especially with all these new conditions they keep adding.
New conditions? Like what?
Like their refusal to allow France to participate in the international monitoring group.
Wow, that seems pretty significant. What's their reasoning behind that?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely raises questions about their true intentions.
And meanwhile, the war in Gaza rages on. It started back in October of 2023 with Hamas's attack on Israel. And it feels like it's just been overshadowed by everything else going on.
It's easy to forget about the ongoing suffering there. But the situation is just as dire.
How bad are things in Gaza?
The death toll has already surpassed 44,000 Palestinians, according to VOA News and Politico.
It's just heartbreaking to think about all the lives lost.
And the negotiations for a ceasefire and hostage release are completely stalled. Hamas is demanding a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
So we have these two separate but interconnected conflicts raging. The one in Lebanon with Hezbollah and the one in Gaza with Hamas.
And both are incredibly complex and devastating.
Peace seems like a distant dream in both cases.
It's hard to be optimistic when you see so much violence and suffering. But what's fascinating and concerning is how events in one conflict seem to directly impact the other.
What do you mean?
Well, if a ceasefire succeeds in Lebanon, it could have a positive ripple effect on the situation in Gaza and vice versa.
So everything is linked.
Exactly, which makes finding a solution even more challenging.
It's like a tangled web of interconnected problems.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered the major conflicts in Lebanon and Gaza.
The ones that are dominating the headlines, at least.
Right. But there are a few other incidents in these articles that caught my eye. Things that haven't gotten as much attention.
Right, like this shooting incident near the Israeli embassy in Jordan's capital, Amman.
Yes, DW and Ariana News both mentioned that.
A gunman was killed and 3 policemen were injured.
It's a reminder that these tensions can spill over into neighboring countries at any time.
Exactly. And then there's the murder of the Israeli-Moldovan rabbi in the UAE.
The one that DW and VOA News both covered.
Yes. This case is particularly disturbing. The rabbi was a representative of the Shabbat movement, known for its global outreach.
Right. And now Israel is calling it a terrorist attack and reissuing travel advisories against non-essential travel to the UAE.
It's a major escalation and shows just how fragile the situation is.
So even as we see some glimmers of hope with the ceasefire negotiations, there are these other events happening that threaten to derail any progress.
It's a constant back and forth between hope and despair.
It feels like trying to put out a fire while someone keeps pouring gasoline on it.
That's a pretty accurate analogy. And it highlights the fact that while ceasefire talks are crucial, we also need to be paying attention to these other incidents and understanding their potential to destabilize the region.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The conflicts in Lebanon and Gaza, the tensions with the humanitarian crisis, and these concerning incidents in Jordan and the UAE.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
It's true. This is an incredibly complex situation with no easy answers.
But even though it's overwhelming, it's important to stay informed and engaged.
I agree. Knowledge is power, and the more we understand about these conflicts, the better equipped we are to advocate for peace and justice.
Exactly. So let's keep digging deeper and see what other insights we can uncover.
There was one particular detail from DW that really stood out to me. Something about Israel cutting off state funds to organizations.
Ah, you mean the anti-boycott law?
Yeah, that's it. It seemed pretty controversial.
It is. It's essentially a way for the Israeli government to punish groups that advocate for boycotting Israeli products or services.
So they're trying to silence dissent.
Many people see it that way. They argue that it infringes on freedom of speech and the right to protest.
But Israel probably has its own justification.
Of course.
Yeah.
They claim it's necessary to combat what they perceive as delegitimization campaigns against Israel.
It's a complex issue for sure.
It is, and it highlights the deep divisions within Israeli society, particularly when it comes to the Palestinian conflict.
It feels like every corner of this situation is fraught with complexity.
It's true. And within all of this, we have to remember the case of Tree Kogan.
The rabbi who was murdered in the UAE.
Yes, from what we know, he was a representative of the Shabbat movement, known for its global outreach.
DW and several other sources covered his story.
And now Israel is calling it a terrorist attack and reissuing travel advisories against non-essential travel to the UAE.
It just adds another layer of tension to an already volatile situation.
Exactly. It's a reminder that security concerns remain paramount and the situation is far from stable.
Speaking of instability, there's this other detail that's been nagging at me.
Oh, what's that?
It's also from DW, and it has to do with some controversial legislation passed by the Israeli government.
You mean the decision to cease all communication with the Haaretz newspaper?
Yeah, that's the one. It seemed like a pretty drastic move.
It was. Especially considering that Haaretz is a left-leaning publication known for its criticism of the government.
Right. It's not exactly a bastion of pro-government propaganda.
Not at all. The government's justification is that Haaretz spreads false propaganda. But many see this as an attempt to silence dissenting voices.
It's definitely a concerning development.
Especially since it came right after Haaretz's publisher, Amos Shokin, gave a speech criticizing Prime Minister Netanyahu and his right-wing government.
And didn't he go so far as to call Israel's treatment of Palestinians apartheid?
He did, and that clearly struck a nerve with the government.
So this whole episode with Haaretz is really about controlling the narrative.
In a way, yes. It's about silencing opposition and ensuring that only the government's perspective is heard.
It's a dangerous precedent to set.
Many people agree. They argue that it undermines freedom of the press and sets a chilling example for other media outlets.
But I'm sure the government has its defenders.
Of course. They say that the government has a right to protect itself from what it perceives as harmful propaganda.
So it's a matter of perspective, I
Yeah,
guess.
exactly. It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
But it definitely highlights the deep divisions within Israeli society.
Absolutely. And it shows how these internal political dynamics can have a significant impact on a country's approach to international relations and conflict resolution.
Okay, so we have the anti-boycott law, the silencing of Haaretz, the rabbi's murder in the UAE, and then these ongoing wars in Gaza and Lebanon. It's starting to feel like a very bleak picture.
I understand why you'd say that. It's a lot to take in, and the situation is certainly dire.
So is there any hope for peace in the Middle East?
I believe there's always hope, even in the darkest of times. But achieving peace requires a lot of hard work and commitment from all sides.
What can be done to move things in the right direction?
Well, for starters, the ceasefire negotiations need to continue, and the international community needs to apply pressure on all parties to reach a peaceful resolution.
But what about the underlying issues that are fueling these conflicts?
Those need to be addressed as well. But it's a long and complicated process that requires dialogue compromise and a genuine willingness to find common ground.
It sounds daunting.
It is, but the alternative is perpetual conflict with devastating consequences for everyone involved.
So what can ordinary people do to help?
Stay informed, engage in thoughtful discussions, and advocate for peaceful solutions.
And never give up hope.
Exactly, because even small acts of kindness and understanding can make a difference.
Well said. I
What?
think that's a good place to pause for now.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have, but there's still much more to discuss.
I agree. So join us next time as we continue our deep dive into the latest developments in the Middle East.
We'll delve further into the complexities of this region and explore the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Until then, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep striving for a better future. It does feel a bit overwhelming at times.
Yeah, but let's not forget about the international community's efforts to broker a ceasefire.
Right. Those negotiations are still going on.
And there's the tireless work of humanitarian organizations trying to alleviate the suffering.
True.
So there are glimmers of hope amidst all the chaos.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, speaking of pursuing peace, you flagged this article from DW about upcoming nuclear talks between Iran and 3 European countries.
Oh, right. France, Germany, and the UK.
Why are those talks significant right now with everything else that's going on?
Well, it's interesting timing
Yeah.
because they're happening right after the IAEA, the UN's atomic watchdog, adopted a censure against Iran
For what?
for their lack of cooperation with nuclear inspections.
Ah, I see.
And in response, Iran said they'd activate new centrifuges for uranium enrichment.
Didn't I read that somewhere?
Yeah, it was in a few of the articles. It's a provocative move, for sure.
It sounds like...
The dispute over Iran's nuclear program has always been a major point of contention, with concerns about their potential to develop nuclear weapons.
Right.
So these new talks represent an attempt to de-escalate the situation. But skepticism remains high.
Especially given Iran's support for both Hezbollah and Hamas.
Exactly. That doesn't help their case.
Many see Iran as a destabilizing force in the region.
And it's not just perception. Iran's actions often speak louder than their words.
True.
They insist their nuclear program is purely for peaceful purposes, but the international community isn't convinced.
So these talks will be closely watched.
Very closely. Everyone wants to see if any real progress can be made.
Okay, so we've got these multiple layers of conflict: Israel against Hamas and Gaza, Israel against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then this broader tension with Iran looming in the background.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It really is.
And let's not forget the ripple effects on surrounding countries like Jordan and the UAE.
Yeah.
We already talked about the rabbi's murder in the UAE and the shooting incident in Jordan.
Right? It's like the whole region is on edge.
Exactly. The Middle East is a tinderbox right now. And any spark could ignite a much larger conflict.
It's a scary thought.
It is. Which is why it's so important to understand the complexities of the situation and to work towards peaceful solutions.
So where do we go from here? What should we be paying attention to as this unfolds?
Well, the ceasefire negotiations are obviously paramount. Any progress on that front would be a major step towards de-escalation.
Okay. But what else?
We also need to look beyond the headlines at the humanitarian crisis unfolding in both Gaza and Lebanon.
Right. The death tolls are heartbreaking.
And
the
right.
displacement of millions of people.
It's a tragedy that can't be ignored.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So what can be done to address this humanitarian crisis?
Well, international aid organizations are working tirelessly to provide relief.
But are they able to reach everyone who needs help?
Access is a major obstacle. That's why a ceasefire is so crucial. It would allow humanitarian aid to reach those in need.
Okay. So a ceasefire is the first step.
Yes. But we also need to think about long-term solutions.
Like what? What would those look like?
Well, addressing the root causes of these conflicts is essential for lasting peace.
Easier said than done.
Oh, definitely. It's a long and complex road.
But it's the only way to break the cycle of violence.
Exactly. It requires dialogue, compromise, and a genuine commitment to peaceful coexistence. The alternative is perpetual conflict with devastating consequences for everyone involved.
You mentioned something earlier from DW about Israel cutting off state funds to organizations that support boycotts of Israel.
Ah, yes.
The anti-boycott law.
Right. That seemed pretty controversial.
It is. It basically allows the Israeli government to withhold funding from groups that advocate for boycotting Israeli products or services.
So it's another way of silencing dissent.
Many people see it that way.
Yeah.
They argue that it infringes on freedom of speech and the right to protest.
But I imagine Israel has its reasons for implementing this law.
Of course. They claim it's necessary to combat what they perceive as delegitimization campaigns against Israel.
So it's all about perspective again. In a way, yes. It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
But it definitely highlights the deep divisions within Israeli society.
Absolutely. And it shows how internal political dynamics can impact a country's approach to international relations and conflict resolution.
We've talked about the conflicts with Hamas and Hezbollah, the tensions with Iran, the humanitarian crisis, the anti-boycott law. It's a lot to process.
It is. But it's important to remember that behind all the statistics and headlines, there are real people whose lives are being affected by these events.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitics and forget about the human cost of these conflicts.
And that's why it's so important to approach these issues with empathy and compassion.
I agree. We can't lose sight of the human element.
Exactly. We need to remember that peace is not just the absence of war. It's also the presence of justice, equality, and understanding.
Well said. I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. But there's still much more to discuss.
I agree. So join us next time as we continue our deep dive into the latest developments in the Middle East.
We'll delve further into the complexities of this region and explore the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Until then, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep striving for a better future. It seemed like a pretty drastic move.
It was. Especially considering that Haaretz is a left-leaning publication known for its criticism of the government.
Right. It's not exactly a bastion of pro-government propaganda.
Not at all. The government's justification is that Haaretz spreads false propaganda, but many see this as an attempt to silence dissenting voices.
It's definitely a concerning development.
Especially since it came right after Haaretz's publisher Amos Shokin gave a speech criticizing Prime Minister Netanyahu and his right-wing government.
And didn't he go so far as to call Israel's treatment of Palestinians apartheid?
He did, and that clearly struck a nerve with the government.
So this whole episode with Haaretz is really about controlling the narrative.
In a way, yes. It's about silencing opposition and ensuring that only the government's perspective is heard.
It's a dangerous precedent to set.
Many people agree. They argue that it undermines freedom of the press and sets a chilling example for other media outlets.
But I'm sure the government has its defenders.
Of course.
Yeah.
They say that the government has a right to protect itself from what it perceives as harmful propaganda.
So it's a matter of perspective, I guess.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
But it definitely highlights the deep divisions within Israeli society.
Absolutely. And it shows how these internal political dynamics can have a significant impact on a country's approach to international relations and conflict resolution.
Okay, so we have the anti-boycott law, the silencing of Haaretz the rabbi's murder in the UAE, and then these ongoing wars in Gaza and Lebanon. It's starting to feel like a very bleak picture.
I understand why you'd say that. It's a lot to take in, and the situation is certainly dire.
Oh, but
we can't give in to despair.
No, of course not. But it's hard to stay optimistic when things look so grim.
I agree. But we have to remember that there are people working tirelessly for peace. There are those on the ground providing humanitarian aid, and those at the negotiating table trying to find a political solution.
And there are those of us who are simply trying to stay informed and raise awareness.
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
So what can we as individuals do to make a difference?
Well, staying informed is the first step.
Yeah.
Like we're doing now. We need to understand the complexities of these conflicts and the different perspectives involved.
And then what?
And then we need to engage in thoughtful discussions with others. Share what we've learned, challenge our own assumptions, and listen to different viewpoints.
And most importantly, we need to advocate for peaceful solutions.
Exactly. We can contact our elected officials, support organizations working for peace, and use our voices to call for an end to the violence.
Sounds like a lot of work.
It is. But peace is worth fighting for.
You're right. You're right. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up for today.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. But there's always more to learn and more to discuss.
Absolutely. This is an ongoing story, and it's important to stay engaged.
So to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Middle East.
It's a complex and often heartbreaking region.
But it's also a region full of rich history, vibrant culture, and resilient people.
And we can't forget that.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep striving for a better future for all